Hello everyone, this is video 1 in a multi-video series on the causal finitism versus causal infinitism debate that was going on around the time of the rationality rules versus capturing Christianity debate on the Kalam cosmological argument. Basically, the purpose of this video is it is a discussion between my friend Logos and myself. I'm fairly knowledgeable on causal finitism and like sort of the technicalities that underlie the debate, where Logos has spent a lot of time researching and coming up with his own theories and ideas on the matter. And so this was basically a way for me, being a novice in this area, to bridge the divide so I'm able to understand the higher level conversations, right? As It often happens that there are like two different levels of conversations that are happening, such that there's like the lower level conversation that perhaps is going on on the debate itself between rationality rules and capturing Christianity, while there's a much higher level conversation amongst PhDs, like Malpass or the digital gnosis guys or whoever, who are having this debate on a higher level that requires like a little bit more background knowledge, and it's difficult for a novice to get this background knowledge. So the purpose here is basically Logos is just I'm asking him questions, and he's basically going through the basics of causal finitism so that a complete novice like myself can understand it. So if you don't have a great grasp on causal finitism and the various arguments, this may be a great video for you. So, without further ado, let's jump right into this. Okay, so Proust, I know, writes about the Kalam, or not the Kalam, causal finitism. Um, Basically, like, what is his positions? Like, why should we listen to what he says? That sort of stuff. Is he compelling? That type of overview.
Right. So Proust wrote this really good book, even if I don't agree with everything in it. I mean, I don't agree with everything in most books, but, I like a good chunk of what's in there. It's called Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, where the aim of the book is just to talk about causal finitism. He's not trying to make a more broad argument for God. It's not like an apologetics text. It's just, reading it just strikes me as a guy looking at a whole bunch of puzzling things from like, philosophy, mathematics and probability paradoxes, all sorts of other stuff, and just trying to like make sense of it. Now, in each different school of paradoxes, whether it's philosophical, mathematical, and so on, there have been made these kind of reasons that you could use to solve each paradox, right? Well, if we assume this principle here, this paradox goes away, and if you use this principle here, this other paradox goes away. And Proust is looking at all that, going like, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like each individual conversation, you could look at the principle and go, yeah, it's kind of reasonable. But if you look at how you have to solve each of these paradoxes, and it's just like, imagine you have your hands outstretched and somebody like puts a book on your hands and then puts another book and then puts another book, right? Each book seems reasonable to read, and then by the end you have this giant stack of books and you just kind of fall over. It's kind of like the metaphor there, where taken as a whole, all these kind of ad hoc principles used to solve these paradoxes kind of start to defy credibility, right? Because it's almost like you can invent new paradoxes daily that would need these new principles, and there's just like no end to them. And so Proust says, and I genuinely believe him, he doesn't seem like a disingenuous guy. Proust says like his motivation for this investigation is, okay, can I make a principle that's slick enough to just solve all these problems without needing like a whole like laundry list of like ad hoc solutions to these problems? Um, and that's basically his main argument, his main draw for causal finitism. It's not like you're a Christian, so you should think, or you're a theist, you should think. It's like, is it kind of weird how we've got like 101 different like ways to solve all these paradoxes that we have to keep in our head at all times, when maybe we could have like one or maybe two principles to just do all this work for us? And it's like, yeah, that's kind of compelling. That's kind of cool. Does he succeed? Maybe not entirely, but I think mostly I'd give him at least like 70% of the benefit of the doubt on this one. I think his argument's pretty interesting.
So before Proust started out on this quest of his, um, to come up with a simple singular solution to all of these paradoxes, was
Mhm.
the general trend toward causal infinitism. Is that correct?
Um, I don't know that causal infinitism's the right way. Because, so to put it in perspective, causal finitism is like putting a hard line on something and saying like, we're going to constrain our language or our model of causal reality or whatever paradigm you want to look at this through. I think of causal finitism as more of a philosophy of language position, which is where I would disagree with Proust, who might think of it more as like a robust causal metaphysical like principle. Um, but like a causal infinitism would be an equal constraint, saying, well, everything's caused by infinite other things or something, right? Like it would be like an opposing principle in the other direction. Most people, I think, are just like agnostic. So the position on the other side seems to be, um, if we can find like a clever solution to a paradox that does not constrain what we think is metaphysically or linguistically or what have you possible, um, then allowing us to have broader options in our models and being able to have open commitments for future problems is preferable to us than having a slick principle that would solve a lot of problems at the same time, but also does constrain, like what kind of models we can make and how we can talk.
Okay, sure. I can see how you're getting there then. So then I guess the one thing that we should just establish first is you mentioned that you have a different interpretation of causal finitism. You view it as more of
Right,
a language thing, as Bruce might view it as a metaphysical claim. Um,
right.
I guess a good starting point, but before we continue, might be to define what specifically is meant or is entailed by causal finitism, both Bruce's view of the metaphysical claim and then also how you view it.
Yes, that's a good place to start. I agree. So Proust's definition, he's got a few in his book, depending on like how mathematically technical you want to get, but he proves they're roughly all equivalent to one basic one that just says something like, um, consider like a graph, not like a y equals x squared graph, but like a graph theory graph where you have like connected nodes modeling like a network or something like that. And imagine you have a graph modeling what's called the causal history of a thing. So let's just do it for like human evolution. So biologists have like this flow chart where we're like we have like Homo sapiens and like our ancestors and the line of common descent and all that stuff. Imagine like that little chart as like a graph where you have like us as a node, and then we kind of have a segment connecting us to our previous ancestor, segment connecting to the previous ancestor, and so on, right? So we have this graph of what's called a causal history. And Proust's view of causal finitism is that no causal history graph can have any node connected to an infinite number of other nodes, either by a sequence of connections, so like A connects to B, connects to C, connects to D a million, an infinite number of times, or you can't have an infinite number of nodes connecting to a single one at once. You can't have like A, B, C, D, E, dot, 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 all connecting to some single node, call it like omega or something. So either one is off limits for Proust. So it's like the usual like Thomist question is like suppose you want to borrow a book from a friend and they're like, oh, I can totally get you that book. I don't have it, but I know somebody who's got it. And they go to ask their friend. It's like, hey, I got somebody who needs a book, right? I heard you have it. And the guy goes, well, no, I don't have it, but I know somebody else who has it. Let me go get it for you, right? Now, suppose that happens an infinite number of times, and the question I always ask is, well, if this is happening an infinite number of times, are you ever going to get your book? And
Right.
there's lots of ways you can like interpret that. So there's like the per se question, which is about like causal dependence in the sense of like say laws of chemistry. Um, like a hydrogen atom. No, let's use like a H2O molecule. I think it's easier to visualize, right? Like that at all times. So we're not talking about like a history here. We're just talking about like a causal relation is kind of maintained by the covalent bonds of the electrons and so on. So H2O's maintaining is causally dependent on the covalence of electrons. And the covalence of electrons is dependent on the properties of charges. And the properties of charges are dependent on maybe some quantum or other particle stuff. I don't know physics, right? But there could be like these dependencies all the way down that aren't like Hume's example of like, you hit the pool ball with the cue at time one, and then at time two, the ball moves forward and hits other balls and blah, 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 right? So it's not necessarily like a temporal thing. And then the per accidens or the temporal thing is the other kind of regress, which the Kalam is more worried about. So like an Aristotelian art, so for a Catholic, here's why Catholics could be like on either side of this, right? Proust broadly is worried about infinite regress in the per se sense, in the sense of like dependencies. So if you look at the Aristotelian argument from Fezer, it's like, why does change happen? Well, okay, something does something to something else to actualize something else. The ball always has a potential to be moved, and Hume hits it with a pool cue or something. Um, but why did the ball have the potential to move? Well, there's something in the ball, and there's something on the surface, and so you have to go through all the chains of that to figure out like what's actualizing what's actualizing what, all the way down to like facilitate a change taking place. And the argument's dependent on the idea that you can't have like this infinite hierarchy of things causing other things. So that's one sense. You could have like an infinite regress that worries you. And in the Kalam sense, you can have the idea that, well, past events. So with the book example, instead of saying, does anybody here have the book I can borrow in this blasted thing, which would be like the per se question, the temporal question would be like, am I going to be dead before I get this book? You're right. If each friend goes to ask another friend, it takes them a minute, and another friend asks another friend, which takes a minute. They do this an infinite amount of times, right? There'll be an infinite amount of minutes before I get this book, right? So non-trivially, will I ever have the book in my hand, right? That'd be the temporal version of the question. And that's the thing that the Kalam people are worried about. And you can see that intuitively in questions like, if there's an infinite past, will the present ever get here? Like, how did it get here if the past was infinite? You never should have been able to count here in the first place if there were like an infinite number of past moments. So that's what's at stake in the regress question temporally. Does that make sense?
Okay, I think so. So you would say that the causal version of it might be something like, well, why do particles have mass? And then if I answer because of the Higgs boson, you could ask, well, why is that? And then we're going to get
Right.
down to like, well, it's some property of the universe. You might ask, well, why it's a property of the universe? And at which point,
Right.
it's just like, well, it just is. That is the finitist sort of, it's just the way it is solution.
Yeah, it terminates somewhere, and they might say, well, it terminates in God, or you might say that it terminates in some necessary property that's not God, like say Oppie. Oppie usually just goes, okay, we'll agree. It terminates finitely somewhere. I just want to move on with the conversation. Let me see how I can, use naturalism to make that terminating thing simpler than what you're talking about. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah. And so then, so we have that as our, let's say, like our causal finitism. And then there's also this sort of concern using the same principle dealing with temporal things where we can't
Exactly.
go back in time infinitely. At some point, we're going to have a starting point so we can get to the modern moment.
Exactly. At some point, you have to stop and say two people like screwed or whatever that made a baby that made a baby that made you, right? You can't go back and keep trying to cash the check. You'd never have gotten here is a crude way of putting it.
Okay, sure, yeah. um, okay,
And
so
so either of those examples are both examples of the same thing, which is the regress, right? You can't have an infinite regress, either in dependency or temporally. The graph doesn't care. The graph is just going to have a bunch of connected nodes, and the nodes could be connecting events in history, they could be connecting dependencies, they could be connecting whatever you want. Proust very much abstracts it because he's got a PhD in math, and he's just like, I don't care. It's a graph, it's got nodes. Here's this property of nodes, right?
okay, so
And the other one was the other kind of causal finitism was you can't have like an infinite number of like even different unconnected nodes connecting to the same node. So let's suppose you have like some node A in space and some node B in space and some node C and D and so on. And let's suppose all these infinite number of nodes just have one path connecting to like some central thing. That's also not allowed. And I forget what he calls that. I have to pull out my book and look. Um, but the issue he has with that is things like Thomson's lamp paradoxes and whatnot. Basically, it's when you have so many things influencing a single event, the skepticism there is, well, what's actually causing what here? Can you actually like point to any of these things or all of them or some of them as like the ones doing the thing, or do we just get these like causal mysteries? Like is trying to construct a graph like this just tantamount to saying, here's all the stuff that's relevant, pixie dust happens, and we have an event. How cool is that? That's kind of his worry.
okay, so um, if you have a whole bunch of potential causes for one event, it's very hard to evaluate what the actual cause of something is. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And a really easy way to demonstrate like the problem here is Thomson's lamp. So I'll just go over that because it's a pretty brief discussion. Let's imagine you have a lamp and the lamp is going to, let's say between 10 and 11 o'clock, you're going to start flicking a light switch for this lamp. And you flick the switch up or down or vice versa, right? Um, every like half interval. So like at 10:30 you'll flick it once, some direction. And then at 10:45 you'll flick it the opposite direction. At 10:52.5 you'll flick it again. And you'll keep subdividing the times in half. And you know, the thing here is once you get to 11 o'clock, right, that lamp is going to be off or on, right? You're going to suppose as part of the paradox that, like, there's only one way the lamp can be. The light bulb is going to be off, it's going to be on. It can't be in any other, like, third position. And so the question is, let's suppose that at the very end of all this mess, that the lamp's on, right? Suppose it's on. It doesn't matter which we suppose. Um, well, what explains the lamps being on? Well, you might say, well, it was off previously, right? So, the very very last time we flick the lamp, it goes from off to on. Now you could make this mathematical argument that says like, well, it's kind of like a Craig-esque argument where it's just like, well, let's suppose you take all the evens out. So like, let's suppose we just go through post hoc and say like, out of all the times we flick the switches, we're going to remove all the even ones, right? And run this through again. Well, you'll still have flipped the switch the exact same number of times. It'd be an infinite number of times, even though you're cutting it in half. You could remove like one fewer flip and still get an infinite number of flips, two flips and still get an infinite number. So like trying to go through and just say like, well, because the previous one was the other one and the previous one before that was the other one, it doesn't quite work because you could remove the previous one, just the previous one. Just like, okay, well, suppose we flipped it one less time than we did. There's still an infinite number of flips, right? Why would the lamp be more off than on than it was previously if we haven't actually changed the number of flips? So that's like the really confusing mathematical version of the argument that people try to run is like, you're actually changing the number of flips, so what the hell? The easiest way to visualize this is like, well, there's no last flip. If there's an infinite number of flips going on between 10 and 11, by definition, there's no end. So if the lamp ends up being on, like by the time like the clock strikes 11, you can't say, well, I'm going to go back and look at the last flip and say, well, it must have been off, and then we flipped it one last time and it was on. There's no last flip to appeal to. That's just the easiest thing to say for the paradox. And that problem of, well, there is no last flip. And so what you have is you have like this cloud of on and off toggles, an infinite cloud of them, like a cloud of electrons or something, right, around this final state of the lamp that causes whatever state the lamp would be in. But you can't appeal to any of it. There's no history you can trace. There's no explanation in the cloud for whatever state the lamp happens to be in.
Okay, so that all sounds good, but let's consider a potential objection. Maybe instead of adopting like a strict causal finitist solution, what if we instead say that for this paradox, we're just going to say that seconds cannot be infinitely divided, right? There is a there's like a smallest unit that you can divide time into, and just for the sake of this, we'll say it's a second. So like at some point, we're just going to reach 11 o'clock because you can't keep dividing the time infinitely because you're going to reach that second, and then you just have to keep going by seconds rather than like getting smaller than that. Does that work as like a solution?
That's a perfectly fair thing to assume, and Proust speculates on that. Proust himself might say, yes. So if you take like a metaphysically strong view of causal finitism, then there's something about reality such that like this you can't take infinite divisions of space and time or whatever to bring about effects for these reasons. And so Proust would say that there's only finitely many subdivisions you can make for your models to make sense.
So okay, so let's say then we'll just use a second as our smallest unit, like just for the sake of this.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
So then, uh, we would say that like okay, so you'll go 11:30, 11:45, 52 and a half, right? And
Yeah,
then keep dividing that, and at some point you're just gonna
you'll
get
reach a
down
second.
to it's like you just have to skip that second, and then you're gonna be at 11 o'clock,
Exactly. Yep.
right? And so that seems to sort of intuitively make sense. Um, but why do we have to conclude that there is a like? Why do we have to conclude that this results in causal finitism? Can we have an infinite number of seconds in the past, even if we can't divide seconds like any further than like that unit of time?
Oh, we could absolutely. And that's the thing. Like causal finitism, Proust is very clear about this. Like one of the things I love about Proust, and Proust and Rasmussen especially write very well together, is I never read their arguments and get the sense that they're just like, you have to agree with our conclusion, or you're irrational if you disagree with our conclusion. They're very, very tempered in how they write. I mean, Proust on his blog maybe might be one way. I don't know. I don't read his blog too much, but like, in his books, the arguments they lay out are just like, here's our reasons for believing the premises. Here are some alternate reasons you could take. Here's reasons why we don't take them. We don't think these trade-offs are worth it. You might disagree, and just be aware of like the trade-offs you're making, and we're good. That's just where the discussion is, and I just love him for that. I don't get the sense that I'm reading like William Lane Craig, which is just like it's just irrational to believe something like Hilbert's Hotel could exist or something. Like Craig is like really like he's hardcore about it. He's like, you're an idiot if you think this is the case. Screw off. It's just like, wow, Craig. But yeah, Proust and Rasmussen aren't like that at all. And that shows up even in his arguments for causal finitism. He's just like, yeah, here's like 5, 6 different ways people have solved this Thomson's lamp paradox, and they're all good solutions. Some of them are a little weirder than others, so I have preferences if I was to take a pick. Um, I like causal finitism because here's some other paradoxes we're going to talk about for which these solutions to Thomson's lamp will not work for these paradoxes, and so now you have to have two different solutions for two different paradoxes, whereas I have causal finitism for both of them. Now you can disagree with that. I prefer the parsimony, but you might prefer model flexibility, and rational adults can just disagree on that trade-off.
So there are these various arguments that might intuitively uh, appeal to us to believe causal finitism. That's the general trend. We look at arguments like this. The case can be made for finitism, so we're going to accept causal finitism based off of like these paradoxes.
Right. It's based off the paradoxes and a commitment to solving them parsimoniously rather than a commitment to model flexibility. That seems to be like the big dividing lines between somebody like, say, Malpass and somebody like, say, Proust. Is Malpass is like, yeah, I don't mind having all these different solutions, just don't try to like strong arm me into thinking like all these metaphysical situations have to collapse into like this nice neat model. And Proust is, he'd say, well, you know, it is breaking my arm a little, kind of like making me limit how I can talk about reality. But like I get this like really parsimonious way of solving so many problems that it's just, I'm not having to carry all these books around of different solutions to all these paradoxes that, it's worth it to me. So it's not just the paradoxes, and it's not the only way you could solve the paradoxes. It causal finitists versus everyone else basically is just a question of parsimony versus flexibility, and that's I think the most constructive way of looking at it.
I guess one objection just that popped in my head, and I think it might be interesting to discuss briefly, is parsimony is generally something that we should look for, right?
Yeah,
But not if it sacrifices, like truth, right? If there's
exactly.
and so it almost seems like you could make a God of the Gaps style fallacy with uh, accepting finitism, right? Because it's like, well, the same way that people would say that God does things, and that's their one explanation, right, for everything.
Right.
There seem to be these analogous sort of or these parallels when we're talking about causal finitism. And I'm not saying that like Bruce is doing this, right, but how do we how are we confident that this isn't going to become a problem for us?
Yeah, and that's the exact argument that somebody like Joe or Malpass would make to somebody like Craig or Coons, or there've been a lot of debates on this, and that's basically the question that comes up, right? Is yeah, the parsimony is really nice, but like we just don't know how possible worlds work, and so we could be getting a lot of stuff wrong. And this is actually a good place to segue into another big disagreement in the argument that follows from the first one. That's about what's called modal skepticism. The idea of can we can we accurately predict or describe ways that possible worlds like must be like from our armchair in this one, right? Um, People who are causal finitists might tend toward, yeah, there are certain basic principles that I think possible worlds have to adhere to, and from those principles you can get causal finitist, guideposts in our conceiving of these worlds. Whereas people like Malpass especially just don't like that. They're like, no, the point of possible worlds is like maximal flexibility in our thought exercises. Like, why should we have to constrain these things? Causal finitists, would have a problem with like all the Grim Reapers, the Grim Reaper paradox in Hilbert's Hotel or something, and Malpass is just like, well, look, I don't see a problem with the Reapers in the hotel until they try to go kill somebody in this really ad hoc manner. Maybe the problem's with the ad hoc manner they're trying to kill Fred and not the Reapers in the hotel. Because if you just remove that and you just think about an infinite number of Reapers living in a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, your brain doesn't explode or anything. It's fine. So why are we limiting the infinite part of the world when maybe it's the way they go after Fred that's the problem, right? And this gets to a big technical aspect of the debate called oh shoot, it's called the permutation principle, the construction principle. Man, it's been almost like half a year since I've done this stuff.
Yeah,
Oh, the patchwork principle. Patchwork principle. I got it
all
from memory. Okay, the patchwork principle. And basically the idea with the patchwork principle is
right. I think that's it for this episode. I know I just stopped it right there on that sort of cliffhanger where we're going to be getting into the patchwork principle and discussing more of the technical aspects of the argument, as well as like some more specifics regarding the argument and the application of like all of these different ideas. But in interest of keeping this video around the 30-minute mark, I'm going to go ahead and stop this right here, and we'll pick up where we left off in the next episode.